There was a great deal of continuity between undergraduate and graduate school for me. I continued to live in Bryn Mawr and commute into town for most of it, which made sense at the time, and I still had a lot of ties to anthropology at Bryn Mawr. Pete Hallowell was living further down the Philadelphia main line, so we often, well, at least occasionally, he came in one day a week. So I tended to give him a ride home after that, and we had a chance to talk. I was trying to continue the way of thinking about what I was doing that developed at Bryn Mawr. One of the other pieces of continuity was Quaker Philadelphia and the political context of Vietnam. It was the Vietnam protests were led by veterans of the 50s civil rights era, so there was a kind of North American-based sense of what the political issues were and how one had to approach them. Bryn Mawr was, of course, founded by, well, of course for me, founded by Quakers in the Philadelphia area, as were Haverford a mile down the road and Swarthmore on the other side of town. One could take courses at any of those three places. At Bryn Mawr, I took history and philosophy of Quakerism twice, once for credit, with Henry Joel Cadbury, who was a weighty friend, a term used for someone who, although obviously he is not, as a clergy person or any formal rank, any different than anyone else, you do pay a great deal of attention to weighty friends. I found him rather formal, pompous, and inflexible. I did learn a lot from him. He didn't like my papers any better than the English department had at Bryn Mawr, but that's okay. The second year, it was taught by a historian who had become the librarian at Haverford, and I found that much more palatable. It gave me a way to understand the phases of what it meant to have a pacifist testimony over a long period of time and how that might have been received in various contexts. I found the Friends meetings attractive on a number of counts. I got involved with a group of people largely from Haverford who were Quakers and conscientious objectors to the draft. People who came out of Philadelphia Quaker backgrounds weren't questioned at all when they filed for conscientious objector status. But it was more complicated than that. It was, for me, a question of, I really liked the silence. The idea of someone who considered themselves able to preach to or lecture others didn't seem terribly palatable. I was raised in the Methodist Church and decided they were a bunch of hypocrites somewhere along the line. I liked the Quaker meetings. Sometimes no one said anything for the entire meeting, and that was okay. There's an interiority to the sense of what one's beliefs from indigenous traditions, I would call spirituality rather than religion, that I liked very much. There was a commitment to activism, that is, to not only hold values or ideas, but to see their consequences in the world and to try to be some kind of force for them. And I found that very attractive. I had a third point, which I have happily lost. Isn't that interesting? Sorry, I edited this out. Oh, yes, that would be it. It was a community. That is, that most of, when you're a student, you know faculty members perhaps, people who work in the dorm, and your fellow students, but there's a kind of separation from the world. And the Quaker meeting was a place where one could find some people of all ages. I got married at the end of my junior year, so I spent a fair amount of my undergraduate education around Quaker meetings, attending Haverford meeting regularly in school, and later becoming involved with Westtown meeting out of town through that family. one of those old Quaker Philadelphia families. That's where I acquired the name Darnell, which I have kept on the ground that it's no one's business who I've been married to. I began to publish and receive my degrees in the name Darnell, and that's the only one that I have ever used, legally or professionally. Okay. Now, it was a really exciting time in Philadelphia to be involved with pacifist politics, obviously. Went to a lot of sit-ins, marches, things. The 1968 uproar, in the sense that it tied to anything outside of North America, I think not. But it was a very turbulent time in which I continued to do things like draft counseling, working with a number of community-based groups in my spare time, and continuing to hang out with mostly West Town meeting and people that I knew from it. The first person I knew who died in the Vietnam War was sailing a medical supply ship into North Vietnam, who was, of course, doing that as a conscientious objector. Nice kid. So it seemed to me a moral and a reasonable stance. I don't consider myself a pacifist in what might be the ideal Quaker sense, simply because if someone were threatening one of my children, for example, or someone else I cared about, I don't think I would mind firing a gun to kill. Maybe that's the mama bear side of things, but there are limits to the pacifism. But as a strategy for living in the world, I think it's a very good one. And the whole notion of nonviolence seems to me a continuing issue in sustainability that I came to think about first through that early experience. Most of my friends in anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania as a graduate student were, of course, also opposed to the Vietnam War. And so there were a variety of takes on that. Not all of them, of course, had the ties to the Quaker position that I did. One of my favorite memories of that is campaigning for anybody but Lyndon Johnson in 1968, when I believe I campaigned for 7 different people in one way or another before voting for Dick Gregory on the Peace and Freedom ticket, which 10,000 people did in Philadelphia. It was supposed to be Benjamin Spock, but he was under court charge for burning his draft card, so he couldn't run for president. Okay. The fun one was standing on a doorstep in South Philadelphia and suggesting that people might want to vote for Eugene McCarthy and having them say, "Oh, haven't heard of McCarthy in politics for a long time." And you say, what is the ethical thing to do here? And I'm afraid I said, "Yes, you vote for McCarthy, see ya!" and ran for my life. Well, obviously that didn't have much effect, but I've always wondered how many people made the same kind of mistake. My father, by the way, was a Goldwater Republican, so I was accustomed to holding my tongue when there seemed no point in a political conversation. Yeah. So it was a very kind of sense that part of what it meant to be activist or radical in those days was to make the world safe for people to think about things. And I think in that sense I did not feel that there was any conflict between my academic work and my commitment to those political issues. And I still think that's the case. I haven't been on a march with a placard in hand for a very long time, but I don't think that's the place where I can be most effective. I think at this point in my life it is speaking to people and teaching that makes that kind of difference. I thought then, and still think, that anthropology is a discipline with good ways of thinking about how to live in the world, and that those are the things that anthropologists in activist positions bring theoretically as well as methodologically and practically to leftist movements. We don't even have a good word for people who want to take those kinds of positions anymore. Most of those words have been colored by things we do not want to associate with them anymore. So I think part of the question is to find a vocabulary for talking about the world we now live in. And those, I think are things to come back to later in our chronology, perhaps. Okay, now, the University of Pennsylvania Department of Anthropology resisted my efforts to think about it like I was still at Bryn Mawr. There were, I think 120 graduate students in anthropology. Not all of them around, because some of them were still working on their dissertations for their 20-year degree. But there were an awful lot of people wandering around, and an awful lot of them did not finish or just disappeared along the way somewhere. So it was, and I wasn't used to that. Nobody failed out of Bryn Mawr. They occasionally asked someone to take a year off, but you had to work to get into trouble with the program. It was simply assumed that if you were there, you could and should want to do reasonably well. Penn, on the other hand, paid no attention to anyone until they'd proved that they needed to be taken seriously. The graduate courses had a lot of undergraduate majors in them, so they were enormous and usually lecture, often not particularly well prepared. When I came to know the faculty as people, I had a very different feeling of who they were, but not all of the courses were, shall we say, stimulating intellectually. And there wasn't much room for people to talk about things. What there was, and what probably kept me from just walking away from it, was that the Department of Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania was based in the University Museum, which had a coffee shop. This was an extremely important thing. There were many days that I walked into the coffee shop when it opened at 10 in the morning and left when it closed at 4:30 in the afternoon. Not talking to the same people all day, but you'd be sitting there talking to a couple of people, and someone else would come up and they would leave, and I just kind of went with the flow. And there were many days that it really was a kind of flow. It's where I get my serious commitment to a 4-subfield discipline, because I spent a lot of time being dragged down to the sub-basement to look at somebody's pots and understand why they thought that was important in a way that I wouldn't have, because I didn't do that. So that there was a very clear kind of intersection, perhaps. There was a much more intensive sharing of that kind of perspective among the students than I think there was among the faculty. Most of the faculty tended to be quite isolated, I think, from one another, which is sort of sad. I was asked a number of times by faculty I came to know fairly well what their colleagues were doing, because they didn't know. And that seems to me, that would never have happened at Bryn Mawr. And then, of course, when Pete Halliwell came in one day a week, I always made sure that I had a chat with Pete. And he had several retired colleagues who did likewise, so I got to meet J. Alden Mason and Samuel Noah Kramer and a few other ancient creatures that I would not otherwise. They didn't turn up for department events. There was no sense of trying to include them in anything. But there were some odd alcoves, attic alcoves, not basement ones, that had offices in them, and they all had offices that you would need a map or a GPS system, to be anachronistic, in order to locate them in the building. It was a real maze. However, and when I got frustrated by the kind of mechanistic quality of the teaching and the structure of the graduate program. Pete was the one who sort of said, now, dear, it will all be all right. You're going to be a very good anthropologist. Just survive it. The program was structured as a boot camp, 4 subdisciplines. At the end of your 4th semester of taking courses, they let you take a prelim, which was an MA final exam and a PhD qualifying exam. Many people did not get through that exam and got their terminal MAs and disappeared. They were very careful not to base the questions on the exams. 3 hours written in 4 subdisciplines in 2 days. There were people who just got up and walked out and, I can't do this, and were never seen again. They told us, and it was correct, that you should not expect the questions to relate to anything you learned in class. I distinctly remember answering most of the questions on the archaeology exam based on Freddie's American archaeology course, because I didn't take American archaeology at Penn, and they would have known that. They also had identifications on them, like site identifications on the archaeology one. Wow. And there were no choices in the questions. You answered what they put out. It really was a brutal exercise, and you saw people that you thought were pretty smart who failed it, so it was not a happy adventure. When I started my first year, they had decided that they weren't going to do that anymore, and that they would have a much more watered-down version of something at the end of the first year, and we were supposed to not have to write final exams in those courses because they would do the 4 subdiscipline, how did you do on all this scope of the discipline stuff at the end of the first year. They changed their mind slightly into the slightly before the end of the first term, when we did not think we had to write final exams in 4 courses, and were told we did. Bob Netting got the short straw on that one and had to explain to the students that they were going to have to take their course exams after all, and that we were back to boot camp at the end of the second year. Yes, the requirement for the PhD was that you would take 20 half courses, that is 10 full courses. That, I suppose, would be unheard of anywhere anymore. And of course, with the prelims in view, one audited other things. So I found myself auditing Stone Age archaeology in Britain. No, sorry, it was Iron Age archaeology. What am I doing? Yes, anyway. Because that was the specialization of the person I figured would be writing the exam. Bernie Wales, he was actually a lovely fellow, but I discovered that somewhat later also. It was interesting. And then we had the things where people would come in to do their classes from 9 to 11, and we would take a break at 10, and everyone would bolt for the coffee shop. I have 2 happy memories of that one. Loren Isley, when I audited his course in the history of physical anthropology, would give his lectures in those same wonderful 8-clause sentences that are so beautiful in written prose, and come out kind of like mumble in speaking. He never, as far as I could see, made eye contact with any student in the class. And at about 5 to 10, he would start edging toward the door and head for the coffee shop. He also bolted out of the room at the end of the class. So the only conversation I ever had with him was at my thesis defense. Sad in a way, because I was doing history of anthropology. And he apparently knew what I was doing, but he didn't find it out from me. The other one was Igor Kopytov, who was a chain smoker, and in those days you could smoke in your classes. So Igor would get quite muddled and periodically try to write with the cigarette and smoke the chalk. We all found that highly entertaining. He was also a bolt for the coffee shop at the break, and usually did not come back as rapidly as one would expect that one might. He was also quite a character. Politically conservative beyond belief, but one of the best courses I ever took was from him in Siberian ethnography, because I already had from Pete's work on bear ceremonialism a sense that the circumpolar world was an interesting issue. And Igor had worked on ecological stuff with the north-south running river valleys of Siberia as something that had a lot of similarity but a lot of difference too to the Canadian North. And so I found that fascinating. I wrote my paper on the Paleo Siberians, which I was afraid he would hate because usually my history of science papers didn't go so well. But there you are. In which I was trying to talk about the evolutionary assumptions that underlay the way in which the interpretation of the Koryak Chukchi and Kamchadal went in those days. There was no A+ at Penn, but he liked that paper. And we got along fine, we just didn't talk about politics. The courses one had to take something in each subdiscipline, and you would have been crazy not to, given the comps process. I also remember Ward Goodenough's course in cultural anthropology, in which he insisted that the assignment was that we had to write a 25-page encyclopedia article on cultural anthropology. And there was a 7-page single-space reading list for the course. I went to Bryn Mawr, so I'd read most of it. I never heard of all this ethnoscience stuff that was new and that Ward was doing, so I had to read that section, but the rest of it was not a problem. The other course I took from him was social structure, and the assignment was, he was a student of George Peter Murdoch, who was responsible for the human relations area files. We had a set of them in the basement. So the assignment for that course was to write a paper analyzing any 10 societies in the world using Murdoch's scheme. I was so irritated by that course by that point that I picked 10 bilateral cognatic societies and explained that they were all quite different from one another, so there. And I got an A. Many of my friends whose strategy was to find the 10 weirdest systems anywhere and categorize them did not get A's on that assignment. I was rather proud of that one. Yes, well, and I guess I don't have time on this stretch to talk about the people I actually worked closely with, but I think it was important to set a tone of what the department was like at that point, because I feel very strongly that there is a departmental tradition, at least in large departments, that one acquires as part of socialization. I have a lot of friends, because of what I do, who went to Chicago or Berkeley or Yale, those being places that did sort of similar things. But they cite different people to the same kinds of things that I cite people that I knew through ties at Penn. So I think it's really important to have a sense of what those places were like at the time that someone was there. Penn isn't like that now. The people who are there now are doing quite different things than they did when I was there. But it had a character of its own.